Thank you. Listen, I'd like to welcome everyone to this high-level roundtable on technology trends for 2025, 2030, and beyond. It's been quite a week and quite a 2 weeks, and the fact that you're here is a sign of your dedication and interest in this issue, and also, I'm sure, your interest in the work of our two very distinguished speakers that we have today, Ben Evans and Françoise Mercadal-Delasalles. Look, you didn't come to hear me talk, so I'm going to stop. And we will pass right away to our speakers. Ben Evans is going to go first. He has a lovely presentation that he's going to give about the future of the internet. And then we will go to Françoise, who's going to join. And let me just stress right off the bat, this is an interactive conversation. We're looking forward to your comments, questions, and observations. We'll come to you after the other two speakers. It occurs to me partly because we were starting a little bit late. I apologize for that. I neglected to introduce myself. My name is Paul Hopkins, for those of you who don't know me, and I'm the president and co-founder of the Lisbon Council. Ben, if you don't mind, I have here a copy of your most recent newsletter, and you begin it with a rather remarkable statement. You say, sometimes in tech, the center of gravity is obvious, and at other times, there is so much going on, it's hard to pinpoint where to look. Already interesting. Then you continue. In 2022, it feels like we might be in the latter. There are lots of areas where trillion-dollar questions are wide open. I think you set the scene perfectly with those words. Tell us what you mean. It's an honor and a pleasure to have you with us here today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. So yes, as I said, there are 50 different things one could talk about, and probably 5 or 6 ways that I could spend 20 minutes talking about them. But I thought I would just give a kind of a brief sort of summary of where technology is, as opposed to where regulation is at the moment, which is obviously one of many questions to talk about. So yeah, is that working? Can you see my slide? You can see my slide? Great, okay. So just a bit of a framing that I thought was useful is to split timelines. There are things that the technology industry is interested in and building for the future, the things that people are excited about for 2030. Meanwhile, there's everything that's happening in the industry today, the billion-dollar companies that are being built now. And then there are all the industries in the rest of the economy that are being disrupted by ideas from 2005, 1995, sort of ideas like maybe people would buy stuff online, or maybe we could do video online, that have taken sort of 15 or 20 years to happen. And so I'll talk very briefly about each of those in turn. Firstly, thinking about the future, the obsessions, excitements, interests, passion in tech, I think you can kind of split into 2 halves. On the one hand, there is Web3 and Metaverse. On the other, sort of everything else, from satellites to quantum computing to neural interfaces, computational biology, all sorts of interesting technologies that are being built. And all the interest and the excitement in Silicon Valley, in the kind of the world of startup creation, is mostly on the left. So these 2 things, sort of Web3 and Metaverse. And both of these, in a sense, are ways of sort of rebranding, reconceptualizing ideas that have been around for a while. So cryptocurrencies were digital gold, money transfer. Web3 is saying, no, this is actually a new way of building software. This is a new way of building computers, new ways of building networks. VR and AR, games headsets, industrial tools, science projects. And Metaverse is saying, no, these are the next universal platform after smartphones. So in 10 years' time, everyone will be using VR and AR, just as today everyone uses a smartphone. That's the theory anyway. I'm not sort of saying that's what I think is going to happen, but that's why people are interested in these things. And so to speak very briefly about each of them, the concept of Web3 is that the web in the 90s was a sort of you had individual companies, individual publishers creating content. Web 2.0, which is a very influential idea sort of 15 years ago, was now we moved to user-generated content and we moved to networks. And so it's all of us that are creating the content and creating the value, but it's still controlled by a company. And so with Web3 says, well, if a blockchain is a sort of distributed computing system and an open computing system, then the users would both be creating, but also controlling and sharing in the value and the governance. And so you could build Twitter or Facebook or YouTube on a blockchain, and then the users collectively would share in the value and share in the ownership. This is also, in a sense, a second coming of open source. With open source software, writing software happened in a distributed way. With Web3 software, the software also runs in an open distributed way. So everyone can look and see the software running, see the rules, see the logic, see the money flow and the flow of data as it's happening. Now, this is a very religious, very messianic idea for how technology might evolve. We go from closed, centralized companies making money to everything being kind of open and decentralized. This is very much what the internet was in the early 90s, very much what open source sounded like in the late 1990s, and people get very excited. We have my obligatory market cap chart. I haven't bothered to update this week. This sort of spikes up and down all the time, which raises a slight question as to whether this is much use as a store of value. But what's more interesting, I think, are the growth of actual software applications. And so you have very early things like OpenSea, which is a platform for trading NFTs, had $5 billion of notional trading volume in January. On the other hand, that was only about 500,000 wallets. And realistically, no, it's more like sort of 5,000 people or 10,000 people who are trading this. And so if one looks at sort of software applications for Web3, you see numbers in the hundreds of thousands or millions. So this is still very early. And I think one can generalize that to say, you know, this is still very early, very technical, very fragmented and very complex, huge amount of creative energy, also huge uncertainty as to what this might look like, how this might evolve. Again, very like the early internet, very like early open source, also, of course, like a lot of things that never ended up working. Shifting gear to look at Metaverse, in a sense, it is easier to talk about. This is a thesis that VR and AR become universal devices, that instead of a smartphone, we use glasses or we use a headset. And so these break out far beyond games, they break out far beyond being niche devices, they become about self-expression, place, identity, popular culture. It's the next wave of how we use the internet. It's also, frankly, something of a mood board. You know, in the early 90s, if you had got a whiteboard and said, what is everything cool that's going to happen in the next 10 years? You'd have written a whole bunch of words on a whiteboard, and then you'd have called it the information superhighway. And you'd have said it will be built by Disney and AT&T and Bertelsmann and Viacom and France Telecom and the post office. The post office is going to build the information superhighway. That's kind of how we thought about this at the time. This is kind of what it's like talking about Metaverse now. Make a list of every cool thing that might happen in 10 years, draw a box around it and call it Metaverse and say, well, Facebook will build it or Google will build it. And then, yeah, that's kind of not really how it works. If we get very tangible about VR, this is still very early. So there's a lot of interest. There's a kind of a spike in consumer interest, and Facebook has probably sold something over 10 million units. But that interest, if you compare that with Roblox, for example, is still actually pretty small in absolute terms. And this, I think, is really the question, is that the technology will get better. But what does that mean? Does it get better the way mobile got better and gave us the iPhone, which became the universal computing device? Or does it get better the way games consoles got better, which is they're amazing, but most people actually don't have one and most people don't care? And so I think if we kind of generalize that to 2030, we have this very deterministic idea. This is amazing. It must be part of the future. Yes, amazing and part of the future, but for what and for how big and how long will that take? After all, it took at least 10 years after the 3G auctions for mobile internet really to take off and become a universal experience. And it's also very unclear what that might look like. So this is a diagram that somebody did in 1995 of something called the cyberspace. And the internet was only one quite small subset of that. And within the internet, there were going to be many different things. And then even within the web, it was not remotely clear how that would evolve. And I think the same thing applies now if one talks about crypto or Web3 or Metaverse. At some point in 10 years' time, some of this will happen, but it's very difficult to say sort of specifically what would that look like. So if that's what we think about for the future, what do we think about for now? Well, there's deploying all of the great ideas from the last decade. That's where all the real energy and company creation and technology is happening today. And in particular, that kind of circles around this phrase digital transformation, which really just means that in the 70s and 80s, big companies bought mainframes. And in the 80s and 90s, they moved from mainframes to PCs. And now they're moving to cloud and software as a service and machine learning. And that's something that happens slowly and takes a long time. Cloud is only sort of 10 or 15% of enterprise IT spending. But as you make that transition, you have orders of magnitude more software, and that software works in different ways. So instead of getting a box from IBM that runs one piece of software, you have hundreds of applications. This is data from Okta on how many different applications there are inside big companies. And the answer is hundreds and hundreds, even just that you know about. And so we have this sort of explosion in the number of software companies, explosion in the amount of software that can happen inside any kind of company, and in the amount of startups that are being created as a consequence of that. Then a third sort of wave of stuff to think about is what I called past, which is all the ideas from 1995 hitting the rest of the economy. And I think a good way to express that is that everything the internet did to music or newspapers is now happening to everyone else. This is what happened. This is decline from peak of newspaper ad revenue, bookstores, and pay TV. It takes time, and different industries get hit at different periods with a kind of a different time lag. This, on the other hand, is what's happening to physical retail. Much more of a kind of a boiling the frog chart. Much slower, much more steady, but also, of course, a $20 trillion global industry. And I think what's happening here is that all of the old value chains that were based on physical assets break apart. We have new models, new entrants, new gatekeepers. You could have made this chart in 1995. It just happens to hit different industries at different times. You know, it started hitting TV about 5 years ago. It's now starting to hit banks, for example. And so it cycles through different industries at different rates. This is what's happening to the US TV market. This reminds me of the Ernest Hemingway line, how did you go bankrupt? Well, gradually and then suddenly. And so we spent 10 years saying, when is TV going to unlock? And then it happened. Consequence of that is Netflix now spends more commissioning original content than any media company except Disney. Netflix and Amazon both spend more than all European broadcasters combined, or all broadcasters in the top 5 European markets combined. That has a bunch of interesting consequences for other markets. So, for example, in the UK, 16 to 34s watch more Netflix and Amazon than all broadcaster content combined, probably more Netflix than all broadcaster content combined. If one shifts gear and looks at e-commerce, we've obviously had something of a bump in the last 2 years. Depending on how big the lockdown was, the effect was different. So the US had a small lockdown, is basically back on the trend line. The UK, on the other hand, went from 20% penetration to 30% more or less overnight. It's kind of worth remembering, particularly we have a European audience, that the future is sort of unevenly distributed. So this is data on how many people in Europe bought online in the last 3 months, and you can see there's in the UK, it's 80%, but in Italy, it's only about 30%. So you have this kind of widespread in adoption. But I think what's more interesting is to dig into those UK numbers. If you exclude grocery, UK is now 40% e-commerce. So if you exclude stuff that needs a refrigerated truck, 40% of new UK retail revenue is now online. And so that's sort of pretty profound consequences for real estate, for property taxes, for city centres, for brands, and for advertising as well. Amazon, incidentally, has built its own logistics business. It's now bigger. This is data to 2020, when it was as big as FedEx or UPS. Amazon say that they will be bigger than FedEx and UPS combined in the course of 2022 in the USA for local delivery. Amazon is also, incidentally, now larger than Walmart on a GMV basis. So more product is sold on Amazon, more dollar value is sold on Amazon than through Walmart. And Amazon has built its own advertising business as a consequence of that, which did about $31 billion of ad revenue last year. $31 billion of ad revenue means that Amazon is bigger than the entire global newspaper business. Amazon's ad business is bigger than global newspaper business, also bigger than YouTube, bigger than global radio, roughly the same size as global display. A couple more charts and then I will pause for breath. We have continuous waves of new competitors here. So this is Shopify, a company that really nobody had heard of 3 or 4 years ago. It did $175 billion of GMV in 2021, which makes it about 45% of the size of Amazon Marketplace. And I think a really interesting kind of part of this, and particularly in the context of this conversation, is Shopify would not sit in any conventional market definition, the same market definition as Amazon. It's a software platform that isn't consumer facing, and yet it's Amazon's biggest competitive question at the moment. The same thing on the other side of advertising. Apple doesn't really have an advertising business, and yet it's become one of the biggest power players in the online advertising industry. Again, you wouldn't put Apple in a market definition of advertising, and yet Apple kneecapped Facebook last year and completely changed the dynamics of online and mobile advertising. So you have a sort of a third example of competition breaking in. This is Shein, which is a Chinese smartphone-based, smartphone-only fast fashion brand that's overtaken Zara and H&M in Google Trends and is now bigger than Zara and H&M combined in the USA for fast fashion sales. So we have all sorts of kind of fundamental shifts going on within the tech industry. And just kind of a couple of concluding points. There's a lot of stuff I didn't talk about. In fact, even in the half-hour version of this presentation, there's a lot of stuff I didn't talk about. But I want to zero in just on one space, which is recorded music, where, as we all know, digital halved the size of the industry, and then streaming has returned it to growth. But if we compare recorded music to some other markets, Netflix is bigger than recorded music. Apple's App Store commission is bigger than recorded music. Indeed, so is Amazon's advertising business, which is also bigger than recorded music. And so what we tend to see here is that the technology industry overturns industries, but doesn't care. The technology industry is building technology industry things. It doesn't actually care what happens to newspapers or TV, or even fundamentally to e-commerce. Technology moves on to thinking about quantum and Web3 and Metaverse, and leaves the consequences behind. And I think it's kind of interesting to compare this with another kind of transformative industry, which is the car industry. This is the cover of Sears Roebuck's annual report from 1960. They are tremendously proud of what today looks to us like a kind of a wasteland of parking lots and freeways and shopping malls. This is the cover of their annual report. And the interesting thing about this is, like, the first 50 years of the car industry was, what's a car? The second 50 years of the car industry is, well, what happens when everyone has a car? And what kind of retailers, what kind of changes happened as a consequence of that? And I think that's sort of where we are now in technology. Like, the first 50 years were, what is a computer? Who has a computer? The next 50 years is, well, what happens now that everybody has a computer? How do we think about that? What consequences does it have in the rest of the economy? And of course, how do we regulate that? With that, I will pause for breath.
Oh, thank you, Benedict. Before we go to Françoise, allow me to abuse my position as moderator and ask you the first question. That was fascinating and has many implications, only some of which I was able to grasp given the speed with which you flew through it. But there's one question that jumps out, which is actually quite a complicated one. You have a background in venture capital. You've seen this both as an analyst and on the investor side. What's the message here for Europe? We were a little slow in the last round. The digital companies, as we all know, famously, that didn't originate here, though there are obviously some very good companies. But we're not at the forefront of this revolution. What does Europe need to do to be at the front of this? And what are the implications for us, broadly speaking?
So that's a question that has a 1-hour answer, I think.
Well, we've got time.
It's many different questions. I think there is one question around where is company creation, and why is it that some of the largest of these companies have been created? In a sense, it's a little bit like saying, you know, it's like these people who say, how do we create poverty? Well, I think most people with a sense of history would say, well, we didn't create poverty, we create wealth. It used to be that we were all poor. And so the question is, why is it that those companies got created in the US and not in Europe? And that has something to do with the Silicon Valley cluster, and it has something to do with having direct access to a market of 300 million people. And so it's a lot easier to create a giant company in that environment than in a market of 10 million people or 50 million people, which is, you know, the case in Europe. I think there's another side, which is how do we think about integrating the questions posed by these kind of companies and developments into policy? What are the policy questions? And again, I could have spent 20 minutes talking about policy questions. What presumptions do we make? What challenges does the nature of these industries pose to antitrust? As I kind of, for example, I mean, as I sort of alluded to, how do you run a competition process when Amazon's biggest problem is Shopify and Facebook's biggest problem is Apple, and those don't sit in conventional market definition questions, and when in 2019 it wouldn't have occurred to you to think that Apple might be a competitive question for the online advertising industry? So how do you think about market definitions and speed and the nature of these industries? I think a third point perhaps might be, you know, we regulate cars, but that took us 75 years and we understand cars. And if you say we regulate cars, that's not one question, that's 20 different things. Transport policy is not the same as our competition policy. And you can't get, and the, how can I put this? Teenage boys getting drunk and driving too fast isn't a mechanical engineering problem. So we have many different questions within how we think about these things, not one question.
Well, that was a very good 2-minute answer, what was obviously a 1-hour response. And hopefully when we get to the discussion, we can come back to some of these issues, because what you touch on there briefly is very much what we're thinking about at great length here in Europe right now. Françoise, I'd like to bring you into this discussion. And let me say it's an honor and a privilege to have you here with us. For those of you who don't know Françoise, she's the co-president of the Centre National du Numérique, which is the think tank reporting to President Macron. They're in the middle of this discussion. A lot of very interesting, very smart people there. Françoise, same question to you. Where do you see the internet going? And I guess I'll add as well my question to Ben. What are the implications for us here? What do we need to be doing in Europe to think about this and build on this and make sure that that we're surfing this wave and not watching it go by?
Well, thank you very much. I'm afraid I won't be as fast as Ben, because my English is of course by definition not as good as his. So sorry for that. I will try to answer you. First of all, thank you very much for this expose, Ben. As usual, it's very impressive. What, in the end, I understand from it is, are we back with this future of internet to the 60s utopia? So we are, a number of us are dreaming of this going back to the utopia of internet, of the emerging internet in the 60s or in the 70s, decentralized, open, distributed, popular, etc., etc., etc. Are those new technologies emerging or coming? Some of them, we know them very well. It's just not so new, but it could be deployed much further. So do they bring us back to this utopia or not? And in a way, this is the question. So difficult for me to answer. And maybe what I can bring to the debate is the view that we developed within the CNNum, the National Digital Council in France. As we didn't have the answer, what we decided to do and what the government asked us to do is to, in a way, step back a little bit on day-to-day regulatory matters, and in the intent to foster open discussion on the relationship between humans and the digital world in all its complexity. And because this technological revolution is bringing an anthropological transition, a huge one. And my only conviction is that those new tools, these new internet emerging, is just going to add on the questions we already had in terms of what does internet do to humanity, which is the answer we are trying to answer. So very ambitious question, sorry, no answer. But so let me bring a number of questions. We ask ourselves what is the role of the today internet in the knowledge, in the capacity for us to know, to exchange our knowledge. So digital and knowledge, digital and truth. What does internet do to truth? What does it do to democracy? What does it do to attention? All those questions, in my point of view, are going to be exactly the same with the internet of the future. Why? Because those tools are neither good nor bad. They are not neutral neither. But in fact, they will be what we want them to be, which will be very difficult because, as Benedict already said, it seems that, as it used to be the case during those 20 or 30 past years, the winners take all. It's, in a way, what I understood from your expose, Ben. Those huge, big tech companies are in the best position today to build the internet of the future. So will there be a few margins left for different models, for different ways of interacting through the networks, etc., etc.? I don't really know. As far as democracy is concerned, same question. In this context of this tragic war, as democracies are so massively attacked, do we think that a new internet, decentralized, based on blockchain technologies, independent of state controls, could help? In a way, yes, for sure. Could help cultivating those bubbles of freedom outside the grip of non-democratic states, and could allow citizens to express themselves. But of course, at the same time, no, because due to the transaction of our economy, the transition of our economy, and the growing exchanges of cryptocurrencies around the world, this could alleviate the sanctions imposed on the Russian economy and financial system, and then alleviating or avoiding the sanctions. So you see, yes and no's. There are so many human questions like this that we could continue to ask. Let's go to psychology and people themselves. There will be questions arised by those new technologies if they really expand. For example, even if immersive technologies can have positive impacts in terms of social or personal construction, these new developments can raise risks that need to be supervised. The fact is, simulated experiences could by nature be more intrusive, even more intrusive than they are today. The creation of avatars immersed in these virtual worlds could thus allow the collection of the significant amount of data, even more significant than it is today. Some also point out the increased risk of neuromarketing that could become even more impactful than it is today. The application of cognitive neuroscience to marketing and communication by key players in the sector, large technology companies already present in this market would benefit from user data from their existing activities and could exploit the network effects inherent to digital services. Another question is, what will our relationship to real world, to material, real reality become? It could really transform our relationship to this reality, and thus continue to act drastically on the human anthropological transition that we are living. So I have no answers. I don't know exactly. I don't know at all what the future of internet will be. What I can say is that the only really very strong, deep conviction and recommendation we have is that the human beings confronted to this transition should be educated to it. Our sole recommendation is on education, and we are working on this. I think that each of us should be allowed to exert its brain and to be able to think of what is happening, which is not the case today. A large digital culture should be dispatched by the governments on schools and outside of schools. Just an anecdote for you, in France, the Ministry of Education has decided that smartphones should be prohibited from schools. We believe that it is exactly the contrary that should happen. We should teach within the school our children how to use, what are their technologies, how they work, what is the usage of our data in the big tech companies, how to create, how to cooperate with those fantastic tools. So I think that technology will continue to evolve. It will continue to evolve rapidly. And due to these massive concentration of capital and brain capital in those big tech companies. They will continue to be the first on the scene. And confronted to this, we have to learn and try to stay master of our future, not the slaves of those technologies. For us, it is definitely the best challenge, whatever the future of the internet be.
Thank you for that. Françoise, rather than using the floor again and asking the first question, I'm going to ask Ben if he would like to have that privilege. Ben, would you like to ask a question before we open the floor?
Not particularly, no. I'm happy to kind of hear what other people would think first, and then go more broadly.
Good. We'll come back to you in a little while. It's going to take at least an hour before I understand half of what you said. David Osimo, I have a question from you, Director of Research at the Lisbon Council.
Hi, and thanks. This was great, but we see clearly different goals and different ambitions. And the question, we have heard the emphasis on the industry and the emphasis on the human side. Human-centric is a word that we hear a lot in Europe. Now, the question is, do we get to shape human centricity or to influence it without a strong industry? Can we shape it? What I mean is regulation a way, or do we really need a strong internet industry to influence this? And the second question is related to that, is really to Ben, from your observation point, since you go across the Atlantic, what's the change that you've seen in Europe over the last year? Do you see Europe with respect to 10 years ago? Are the problems still the same? Is it better? In what sense? What has changed? What is your really feeling about the evolution?
So I imagine the first question is for me. So
yes.
My answer is quite clear. There is no exclusion between education, regulation, and economy. But I think that the authorities in numérique, in digital in Europe, for a while have been concentrated on economy and regulation, which is very clear and very normal, and I absolutely evaluate this. And this is really fundamental and important. And all the regulations that are discussed at the moment in Brussels, the DMA, DSA, etc., are very, very important regulations. So, and we fully support that. As far as economy is concerned, we've been repeating for years now that we should have in Europe giants in digital like they have in the US. It's just not happening very fast, but well, let's hope it will happen. What I'm saying is just that, okay, very good to be concentrated on regulation and economy, but don't forget that we have, as public governments, the responsibility of educating our concitoyens, our people, and they will react. If we give them the means, they will be the one to know exactly what they want to do with those tools. And again, there are very bad usages of those tools that can happen in the Web 2 and in the Web 3 probably. And there are so many good things. And there are so many very intelligent, bright, creative models that could be invented. We could have different networks, social networks. We could use those technologies at school, and even avatars and virtual universes could be used in order to invent new societies, new communities, etc., etc. So this is only what we say. Human centricity does not exclude regulation and, of course, economy.
Okay, thank you, Ben.
So, I mean, sort of a brief point on the first question and then answer on the second question. I mean, look, TikTok is Chinese. So I don't think one can sort of run to a model that says, you know, we need to have our own champions in Europe and that will solve problems. I mean, this was sort of the fundamental problem with, in many ways that Trump's attempt to deal with TikTok 2 years ago was just completely idiotic, because it just presumed there was just going to be one company. I think you just have to have, if you're going to have regulations, those can't be directed on a kind of a national basis or on a country basis. They kind of have to be based on principles across everything. I mean, to the sort of second question, how has Europe changed? I mean, look, there's a sort of a general point is that, when the consumer internet started in 1994 with Netscape, there were maybe 20 or 30 million consumer PCs on Earth, and probably 3/4 of those were in the USA. I mean, sort of talking very broadly. So the vast majority of computers were in, the great majority, let me get the number right, roughly half the PCs on Earth were in America. And the cluster was in Silicon Valley. And so this was a small industry with a cluster in Silicon Valley and the majority of adoption in the US. And today, 5 billion people on Earth more or less have a smartphone. And so the vast majority of Facebook's users, of Google's users, of YouTube's users, of Twitter's users are outside the USA. And so this has become a much more global market. There are massively more companies being created. And, part of the point of my slide on how many software companies are inside a big company is, like, there's just orders of magnitude more companies, more technology companies being started now. And those are no longer only happening in Silicon Valley, because the industry has just become so much bigger. And so part of the consequence of that is there are massively more startups in Europe. Now, London is not San Francisco yet. Well, there's a bunch of ways that's good, incidentally, having lived in San Francisco for 5 years. But, it's not Silicon Valley. But we're seeing kind of a steady diffusion of technology use and company creation outside of that original very small cluster. And Europe is clearly a big part of that. Frankly, so is Latin America, so is India, so is Southeast Asia, so is China. So there's just a sort of a huge shift from basically a very small industry focused in one very small part of the USA to a global industry.
Terrific, thanks. Anders Sigmund, would you like to unmute yourself and put your question directly? Hello? Mr. Sigmund, are you still with us? Okay, we'll come back to him in a minute if your camera is working. Leonard Koschwitz, would you like to unmute and ask your question to Ben directly?
Sorry, it took a while to unmute myself.
Oh, there you go. Okay, good. Okay, please, the floor is yours.
I was just wondering, because it was very interesting, both presentations. Thank you very much. And I was wondering, what do you see as main challenges for new technologies for both physiological health of humans, but also mental health of humans? Do you see any trends that we should be careful and especially attentive about?
So I'm generally on the skeptical side of these kinds of conversations. And I tend to recall the way that bicycles were going to make young women infertile, and novels were going to destroy morality, and Elvis Presley and the Sex Pistols were the death of Western civilization. And in America, comic books were causing juvenile delinquency, and definitely rap music was going to destroy civilization.
Well, they sort of did, but...
Well, yeah, maybe. So, and I think that one of the challenges in technology in general is there are things that people just sort of say as though they're unquestionably true, that don't have actually any evidence base behind them. Things like screen time, filter bubbles, attention deficit, depression. These things there are certainly fields where people just kind of assert that that's true, because they've heard other people saying that it's true. And there's a sort of a kind of a meta irony here, in that there's a huge amount of misinformation about Facebook, in that people kind of repeat things that meet their cognitive biases about social media. That said, clearly these are kind of things that one needs to worry about and think about, just as we worried about, how much television children watch, and we probably wouldn't let a 10-year-old watch 10 hours of television on Saturday and Sunday. But I think one should also be sort of slightly cautious and skeptical about thinking that these are going to, and remember how much we worried about things in the past that we all seem to survive. I mean, there is a joke that what Facebook has done to our parents, what our parents worried that the internet would do to us. You know, it made our parents into conspiracy theorists rather than us.
Well, there is some evidence. Françoise, would you like to come back on this question?
Well, there are anyway, if there are no absolute evidence, there are a number of studies all around the world already, in particular in terms of the captation, I don't know if it's the right word, captation of attention through those business models that are quite obvious. Then again, I have the same answer. We are free to go on those screens or not to go there, and it's again a question of culture and education. That's it.
Okay, thank you. Leonard Koschwitz, did you get your microphone situation resolved there? Good. If you'd like to ask a question.
I did. Thanks a lot. And thanks
can you introduce yourself too, please?
Yeah, my name is Leonard Koschwitz. I'm with Google. And so my question is, I thought it's a great question for Ben, but I think I'd be interested in both of your views on that. Speaking about the Metaverse and Web3, which I would agree is a box of many things that we've seen already, but there's also new concepts, especially when we think about smart contracts or the immutability of blockchains. And so I'm curious about your thoughts where the first touch points between these technologies and regulation will be. Obviously, regulation has made a habit of somehow removing things from the web, can be for privacy reasons, for misinformation reasons, or other reasons. So I'm just wondering, in your views, whether you'd see first touch points in these areas, anything else obvious that stands out? I'm curious what the first kind of regulation title could be.
Well, so I think another way that I could have talked about crypto is to say we've had sort of 3 steps of crypto. And step 1 is it's digital gold and it's payments and it's money. And step 2 is DeFi, which is you could build a financial application on this. And then Web3 says, no, you could build any kind of application on this. And so I think the sort of the first touch points for regulation are on the finance side, because it's relatively easy to understand, okay, it's a payment system. And then you argue, well, is this a security or not? Is this a security, or is this an instrument, or is it just money? And then obviously that goes to, you know, people are building a lending application. Well, it's a lending application. The fact that you built it using blockchain is neither here nor there. I think you're quite right. Where you get to, for example, building a social messaging application on a blockchain, then that gets quite a lot more complicated, because you get to questions of, well, what does privacy mean? How would privacy work? What does consent mean? Is this public or private? And I don't think we know the answers to those. I think in many ways, Web3 technology today, it's like looking at Linux in the early 90s. Like, it's not, there's nothing there that a consumer can use yet. And there's many other layers that need to get built first before you could use it. We're sort of looking at, it's like we're looking at TCP/IP and saying, okay, what would that mean for the advertising industry? Well, you're going to build a whole bunch of stuff first before you can answer that question. And, you know, there's many questions around what would a consumer application look like and how would it work before that need to get answered. You know, we are many years away, 5 years away from being able to build like a mass market consumer application. And then, yes, all of those questions apply. What would it mean for it to be private? Do you encrypt things? What would it mean for you to demand to decrypt it? How would competition law work if 2 distributed organizations decide to merge? Like, there's no one to sue. So there's lots of those kind of questions, but at the moment they're all very sort of theoretical.
But they're fun questions. Françoise, would you like to come in?
Oh, I fully agree with that. There are so many questions, and from the point of view of the regulator, it's and the European regulator, it's particularly difficult to encompass. Very difficult. Probably the first touch point is money, of course, as money is the first expression of sovereignty, and but again, there could be an interest for the governments and the states to continue to live with those independent monies. And on the contrary, there could be so many difficulties to let them continue to grow. So no answer at the moment. No answer at the moment.
Okay, thank you. Listen, partly because we don't have that much time remaining here, I'm going to start grouping questions, and we'll take 3 before we come back to the speakers. First of all, it's an absolute honor and a pleasure to see my good friend Robert Madeleine on this call with his hand raised. For those of you who don't know Robert, he was formerly Director General of DG Connect, the European Commission authorities in this area. Robert, would you like to unmute and join the conversation? And it's very nice to see you.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Great conversation. I mean, I think the first thing I would say is that the time scale is important. How long do we have to better frame what we're doing? In a field I followed since when I was in the Commission around cyber psychology and behavior, they were writing 25 years ago, in fact longer, 25 years ago, they were writing about the early instances of VR, its implications for the impact on human beings, and some of the underlying issues are the same. So, and then what about the price point? Because as Ben was saying, you can have cool stuff, but it doesn't actually get into the real world unless the price points are right. So I think having a sense of timescale is important. The second comment I wanted to make, however, is I'm actually a more interventionist optimist than perhaps Françoise. It's not just a question of choice, and it's not just a question of throwing these seeds on the ground and seeing what grows. If you think about the life and death of American cities, architecture matters. And if we are intentional and we say this is the way we want human society to evolve, then we can actually interact in a sandboxy, win-win way with the people building metaverses, and there's certainly going to be several of them. And I think we should therefore not just sit back and say how fascinating it all is. We have to sort of find ways to get involved in a deliberative way. And it may well be that the AI sandbox discussion going on in the EU around legislation on AI is going to be where the whole thing kicks off, because a lot of what we're talking about here will require AI, and it will be high-risk instances of AI.
Okay, thank you for that, Robert. I, by the way, forgot to mention, Françoise, you and Robert have something in common. You both have the same alma mater, but I'll leave you to discuss that offline. I also see my good friend Edith Herzog. Edith, if you would like to unmute and join the call, it's an honor and pleasure to have you with us here today, too. You're muted. Grace, could you? As we see, the technology still has a ways to go.
If you just go to the top right hand of your screen, and you just click the microphone button.
Okay, well, while she's unmuting, we'll take another question. Edith, we come to you next. Dan Chirondajan, if you would like to unmute and ask your question.
Okay, can you hear me? I hope that you can hear and you can see me.
Yes.
So I work for the European Commission on the Joint Research Center. So François mentioned about education, but education is something that requires time and money. And politicians today, they are not so disposed to give time and money. And we are wondering how can we overcome these obstacles. I will be very interested to know your views on this. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. And we'll take one more briefly from Jorn van Lucke. He's having trouble too. Edith, did you get it? Did you get your problem solved?
What was the name again? Sorry,
Paul.
Is this a Teams issue?
Yeah, I mean, I can see on Jorn's question. I mean, he's asking about Internet of Things, smart government, real-time internet, and so on. There's two answers to this question. One is there's 50 other things I could have talked about. I could have talked about Chinese semiconductor sovereignty. I could have talked about privacy regulation. There's many things one could talk about. I think Internet of Things has now disappeared into another winter, and I don't think there's any such thing as Internet of Things. I certainly don't think there's any such thing as a smart city. I think sometimes there are things that are connected to the internet. But I think if a city builds out a network of security cameras and connects those to a network, that doesn't mean it's become a smart city. Those are security cameras. If your transit system uses network connected ticket machines, and that gives you data on the transit system. That hasn't become a smart transit system. It just means you've got data on the ticket machines. And so I think in that and in many other fields, it's kind of useful to be sort of tangible and specific about what it is that we're talking about. It's a little bit like these phrases like, you know, we need data sovereignty, or China will have more data, or America will have more data. It's like, no, it's not. There's no such thing as data. There's instrumentation from your traffic cameras. Like you have these sort of specific individual units. And so the first question on education, I don't think I have a long answer to this. Sure, I think a short answer to this might be, look, it took us 100 years to regulate cars, and we don't have that long to regulate tech, but we grew up with cars and we understood how they worked. And if a politician says, I want you to make cars that don't crash, we would kind of understand that wasn't how things work. But we are sometimes in a phase where politicians say, I want you to make secure encryption that the police can read, and not understand that this is a nonsensical statement. And so there is sometimes a challenge in just sort of understanding what are the realistic parameters of policy, and what are the trade-offs and the complexities.
Did you get to Robert's question too? Robert, did he get to your question?
I'm sorry,
It was more a comment, I fear, but it was about the time scale. Do we have 10 years?
Time scale, that's right.
So my question to Ben is, do we have 5 or 10 years? And my question to Françoise is, can we do intentional co-architecting and not just wait for it to happen?
Okay, so specific timeline for VR is actually, it depends, because there's one view that says Moore's law, more work, it will just grow and grow the way, say, smartphones grew from 2000 to 2010, and it will just continually, we're on the curve now. There's another view that says we need some other breakthrough of principle before this would really start working and break out of being. The other view says this is a niche of games consoles. It's going to be tens of millions of people. It will not break out until we have some other fundamental breakthrough of principle that happens at some indeterminate point in the future, in which case it might not be 10 years, it might be 30 years. So that's kind of the spread of views. So there's one view that says, look, in 5 to 10 years time, hundreds and hundreds of millions of people will be doing this. And there's another view that says, no, it might not be for 30 years, or, you know, N years in the future, there might be some totally, like, it might need a neural implant. It might need some totally different technology that we don't have.
Oh, we finally got around to the neural implant. Françoise.
Yes, no, Robert, I fully agree to what you said. Of course, I'm fully in favor of core architecture. I'm fully convinced of that. The only thing we want to do is draw a little bit the light on what for us has been a little bit forgotten during those past years. That is to say, the capacity of the governments to give the means to people to understand, and them to choose their way in this new world. That's all what I wanted to say. And the light is not really driven on that side. It's the reason why we want to emphasize this question. We've been inspired a lot with a philosopher who died a few years ago, Bernard Stiegler, and he explains something. He explains that the speed of these innovations and the speed of the evolution of these technologies is really very, very huge, and is very much faster than the capacity of our brains to understand what is happening. And there is a sort of this gap, cognitional gap between, again, the reality and the evolution of the innovation and our capacity to understand it. And this creates probably the foundations for anxiety and reject of those technologies, and incapacity to build interesting, intelligent things. So, of course, we have to cooperate between people and states, co-architect. We have to give intentions, visibility, etc., etc. I fully agree with that, and I am an optimistic. But don't forget education. Education is key, and we have the money. It's just a question of deciding it. Let's decide where to put the money today. Where is it important to put the money today? Okay, defense. Okay, and education.
Well, thank you both. Listen, we're running out of time, and I apologize to the people whose questions we didn't get to. And I actually should probably apologize twice, because I'm going to once again abuse the floor and ask the last two questions myself. My first one is, I'm a very lazy man, and rather than giving conclusions, I'd like to ask the two of you to do that each. And I'll give it to you in the form of a question. What will you take away from this discussion, and what would you like to carry with you? Now, I said I was going to ask two questions, and the second one's even a little more precise. Are we doing enough? Are we doing enough here in Europe to build the companies of the future, to capture these waves that you described so beautifully, Benedict, and also to, of course, to protect the population in the right ways against threats that all of us know are very real, even if we have trouble defining and understanding them sometimes? Are we doing enough in both of those spheres? Who would like to go first?
I think we're doing a lot. We are doing a lot, and there are so many people involved in this transformation, in this and understanding of what is at stake. And I am convinced that Europe is really going the right way now. But what I will remember from this conversation is exactly what Ben said. We just don't know, and everything will depend on the usage, on the capacity of people to handle those innovations and what they will do with it. And it's the reason why, again, I'm insisting so much on people and their capacity to be actors and not just slaves.
Good, thank you, Ben.
Yeah, I would come back to my comparison with cars. That, you know, cars changed the world and then created all sorts of problems. But that was complicated, and it took a long time to work out what all of those things meant and how to do them. And so now the internet has changed the world and caused all sorts of problems. And we kind of have to react a lot more quickly, but we also have to be kind of conscious of the complexity of that. And I think when people in technology say, oh, this is complicated and you don't understand, that tends to get taken as special pleading, that the rules shouldn't apply. It's actually the opposite. What that means is technology policy is just as difficult and complicated as any other kind of policy. It's just as hard as education policy or energy policy or transport policy. You can't have all of the things you want all at the same time, all at once. And you can't make a speech that says, well, you're just going to have to figure it out. Well, no, it's not as easy as that. And I think that's kind of the key policy question, that, you know, this stuff isn't any simpler than anything else.
Good, thank you. And listen, on that note, there's a whole stack of people I need to thank, and I'll try to go through it quickly. First of all, thank you, Françoise, to you, your team, the group, and the French for your leadership of the European Union at this crucial time. You contributed many ideas to the discussion. I look forward to continuing it and developing and working on these issues with you. Ben, your newsletter is fantastic, and allow me to give it a giant plug. For those of you who haven't subscribed already, go on his website and do it. If we know anything about the internet and the future of digital technologies here, it's a mere reflection of what I learned from Ben every Monday morning when I wake up and start the week with his newsletter. And I'm only being half facetious when I say that. We've really learned an enormous amount from you over the years. And finally, to all of you, it's a crazy time. We didn't even get to talking about Ukraine, and we might have, by the way. But I wanted to thank you for taking time out of this to come here and to be with us, for your questions, your thoughts, and your concerns. And finally, to my own team, thanks for helping us to pull this off. And let's give our speakers a very warm welcome before we go away, have a drink, and start the weekend. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.